Welcome back to the Versatile PC channel. In today's video, we continue our benchmarking series, and this time we focus on the mid-range GPUs. In today's video, we have featured the RTX 3080 Ti, which is a few generations old at this point. However, in today's market is considered pretty much in the mid-range. On the used market, it's very common to find this GPU around the $450 range. Some models being cheaper, some models being maybe a little bit over. Another card we're using is the previous generation from AMD, and that is the RX 7900 GRE. At the MSRP of it new, it was very comparable to the RTX 4070 and 4070 Super. Today's market, you can find it a little bit around the $450 range, sometimes $500. Next up, we have the RX 9070. Supposed to have an MSRP of $550 US. However, it is very much in the $600 range. Finally, the last card on our list is the RTX 5070, which has now got down to around the MSRP of $549. Let's go ahead and jump into our benchmark test. As always, 6 games that we tested is 4 resolutions, 1080p, 1440p, and 4K. All games using high settings, no ray tracing, no upscaling, no frame generation. We'll be doing deeper dives into each of the new generation cards in the future if you stay tuned for that content. But for now, let's jump into our benchmark data. Jumping into our benchmark data, Black Myth Wukong built-in benchmark at 1080p high settings. You see that the 7900 GRE is able to render 125 average FPS. The RX 9070 is able to do 184 average FPS. The ROG Strix 3080 Ti is able to do 130 average FPS. The RTX 5070 is able to do 159 average FPS. If we go compared to our previous base card, which was a 2080 Super, that means that the 7900 GRE is 31.5% faster. The 9070 is about 67.6% faster. 3080 Ti is about 35% faster than the 2080 Super. The 5070 is about 54% faster than the 2080 Super. If you compare the mid-range cards to each other, that means that the 3080 Ti and the 7900 GRE are pretty close in comparison. 3080 Ti coming out only about 4% faster than the 7900 GRE. The RX 9070 coming out 30% faster than the 3080 Ti. And you have the 5070 in the kind of the middle there at about 20% faster than the 7900 GRE and the 3080 Ti, 10% slower than the 9070. Black Myth Wukong at 1440p, however, see 7900 GRE is able to render. The 7900 GRE is able to render 117 average FPS. 9070 is able to do 168 average FPS. 3080 Ti is able to do 121 average FPS. RTX 5070 is able to do 147 average FPS, meaning at 1440p in Black Myth Wukong, the 7900 GRE is about 37% faster than the 2080 Super. RX 9070 is about 70% faster than the 2080 Super. 3080 Ti is about 40% faster than the 2080 Super. And the RTX 5070 is almost 60% faster than the 2080 Super. Black Myth Wukong at 4K, built-in benchmark. The RX 7900 GRE is able to average 100 FPS. The RX 97 is able to average 141 FPS. RTX 3080 Ti is able to average 103 FPS. RTX 5070 is able to average 121 average FPS. Marvel Rivals at 1080p. The 7900 GRE is able to average 139 average FPS. RX 9070 is able to get 177 average FPS. The 3080 Ti is able to average 144 FPS. The RTX 5070 is able to average 166 FPS. Comparing it to the 2080 Super, that means the RX 7900 GRE is 53% faster than the 2080 Super. RX 9070 is about 75% faster than the 2080 Super. The RTX 3080 Ti is about 57% faster than the 2080 Super. The RTX 5070 is about 70% faster than the 2080 Super. In Marvel Rivals, that means that the 5070 and the 9070 are within 5% of each other, with the 9070 coming out a little bit ahead. The RTX 3080 Ti and the RX 7900 GRE are pretty comparable in this title, being only a 5% difference as well, with the 3080 Ti coming out slightly faster than the 7900 GRE. Moving on to Marvel Rivals at 1440p, the RX 7900 GRE is able to average 111 FPS. The RX 9070 is able to average 135 FPS. The 3080 Ti is able to average 110 FPS. The RTX 5070 is able to average 123 FPS. Comparing all four cards to the 2080 Super, that means the 7900 GRE is 58% faster. The 9070 is 75% faster. The RTX 3080 Ti is about 57% faster. The RTX 5070 is about 67% faster. Comparing all the mid-range cards to each other, again, the 7900 GRE and the 3080 Ti come out pretty close to each other in performance. At 1440p, the 9070 seems to really pull ahead in this title over the RTX 5070. Moving on to Marvel Rivals. Moving on to Marvel Rivals at 4K, you get the 7900 GRE with an average of 65 FPS, the 9070 with an average of 79 FPS, the RTX 3080 Ti with an average of 66 FPS, and the RTX 57 with an average of 71 FPS. Pretty comparable here in the mid-range, with all of the mid-range cards performing pretty within, with the 7900 GRE and the 3080 Ti coming out pretty close to each other in performance. The 9070 comes out about almost 10% ahead of the RTX 5070 in this test. Moving on to A Plague Tale Requiem at 1080p high settings. You see the 7900 GRE averaged 109 FPS. The RX 9070 averages 125.3 FPS. The 3080 Ti averages 100.7 FPS. The RTX 5070 averages 108.4 FPS. Comparing it to the 2080 Super, at 1080p, you see that the 7900 GRE is 64% faster. The RX 9070 is about 76% faster. The 3080 Ti is about 57% faster. And the RTX 5070 is about 63% faster. Comparing them to each other in the mid-range, you see that the RTX 5070 and the 7900 GRE are pretty close in performance at 1080p. You see that the RTX 3080 Ti is the slowest of the bunch. You see that the RX 9070 is the fastest of the bunch by almost 10%. Moving on to Plague Tale Requiem at 1440p, 7900 GRE is able to average 81.5 FPS. RX 9070 is able to average 92 FPS. The RTX 3080 Ti is able to average 78.3 average FPS. The RTX 5070 is able to average 79.2 FPS, meaning at 1440p, 7900 GRE, the RTX 3080 Ti, and the RTX 5070 are pretty close to each other in performance, with about a 3% difference between the three of them. The 9070 really showing its legs here at 56% faster, almost 10% faster than the other cards. Moving on to A Plague Tale Requiem at 4K, you see the 7900 GRE able to average 44.1 FPS. The ASRock Steel Legend RX 9070 is able to average 53.8 FPS. The RTX 3080 Ti is able to average 47 FPS. The RTX 5070 is able to average 45.1 FPS. None of these offer great performance as they all fall below 60 FPS. Looking at the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion Remastered at 1080p, you see that the RX 7900 GRE is able to average 112.6 FPS. The ASRock Steel Legend RX 9070 is able to average 133.1 FPS. RTX 3080 Ti is able to average 86.6 FPS. The RTX 5070 is able to average 114.5 FPS. Comparing them back to the 2080 Super, you see that the 7900 GRE comes out almost 50% faster. You see that the RX 9070 comes out 65% faster. The RTX 3080 Ti comes out 24% faster. The RTX 5070 comes out 51% faster. Comparing the mid-range cards to each other, you see that the 3080 Ti is the slowest. It becomes the slowest in this title, being almost 20% slower. Oh, being almost 25% slower than the 7900 GRE. The RTX 5070 and the RX 7900 GRE are pretty close to each other with a 2% difference. And then the RX 9070 really goes ahead by almost 15% in this title at 1080p. Moving on to 1440p, however, you see that the 7900 GRE is able to average 85.6 FPS. The 9070 is able to do 95.4 average FPS. The RTX 3080 Ti is able to average 68 FPS. The RTX 5070 is able to average 78.9 FPS. The 7900 GRE really extends the lead on the 5070 in this title at 1440p for some reason. We're going to Oblivion Remastered at 4K. You see that the RTX 5070 and the RTX 3080 Ti become pretty close to each other, pretty neck and neck, along with the 7900 GRE, all averaging about 44 to 46 FPS. Then you see the ASRock Steel Legend 9070 only able to average 52 average FPS. Only able to average 52 FPS, basically meaning none of these cards are offering a playable experience at high settings without frame generation, or none of these are able to offer over 40 FPS without upscaling involved. So moving on to Forza Horizon 5. In Forza Horizon 5, the RX 7900 GRE is able to average 254 FPS. The 9070 is able to average 311 FPS. The RTX 3080 Ti is able to average 208 FPS. The RX 5070 is able to average 257 FPS. Comparing them all back to the 2080 Super, which is our base card for these tests, the 7900 GRE is 69.5% faster. The RX 9070 is 86% faster. The RTX 3080 Ti is about 31% faster. The RTX 5070 is 70% faster. Again, the 7900 GRE and the RTX 5070 are pretty neck and neck in this title using raw rasterization. 3080 Ti definitely shows its age in this test, being slower than the 9060 XT 16GB actually in this test. It was slower any other time. No, it hasn't been slower any other time. Moving on to our Forza Horizon 5 at 1440p. However, you see that the RX 9070 XT is able to average 219 FPS. The Steel Legend ASRock Steel Legend. Let's go ahead and do this. Actually, let's move our thing to 350. Okay, let's go ahead and change our scale. Moving on to Forza Horizon 5 at 1440p. The RX 7900 GRE is able to average 219 FPS. The RX 9070 is able to average 266 FPS. The RTX 3080 Ti is able to average 177 FPS. The RTX 5070 is able to average 211 FPS. Showing in this title, the RTX 3080 Ti really seems to struggle in this title compared to even the 9060 XT 16GB being quite a bit faster here. Comparing the cards to each other in the mid-range, you see that the 7900 GRE is about 10% slower. Oh, no, it's not. Comparing these cards in the mid-range, the RTX 5070 and the RTX 5070 and the RX 7900 GRE definitely perform pretty close to each other, and the RX 9070 really pulls ahead. Moving on to Forza Horizon 5 at 4K, offers probably the best performance out of the games tested in our benchmark charts. This seems to be the lighter game to run. The RX 7900 GRE is able to average 155 FPS. The RX 9070 is able to average 188 FPS. The RTX 3080 Ti is able to average 130 FPS. The RTX 5070 is able to average 144 FPS. comparing the mid-range cards to each other. Now you see that the 3080 Ti at 4K does come out ahead of the 9060 XT 16GB, being only 3 FPS, but a win's a win, as they say. The 7900 GRE pulls ahead of the RTX 5070 at 4K by almost 10%, and the RX 9070 seems to really stretch its legs here at 4K. Moving on to Black Ops 6 at 1080p, built-in benchmark we used for. Moving on to Black Ops 6 at 1080p. Moving on to Call of Duty Black Ops 6 at 1080p, the 7900 GRE is able to average 147 FPS. The RX 9070 is able to average 171 FPS. The RTX 3080 Ti is able to average 113 FPS. The RTX 5070 is able to average 123 FPS. The RTX 5070 Ti is able to average 122 FPS. Call of Duty has always seemed to be a game it does really well on Radeon GPUs. So in this title, the 9060 XT 16GB actually performs better or the same as the RTX mid-range card. So the RTX 3080 Ti is about 7% slower than the RX 9060 XT. The RTX 5070 performs on par with the 9060 XT 16GB. The Resurrection Legend really pulled out really far ahead in this title, being over 25% faster than the RTX 5070. Moving on to 1440p, in Call of Duty Black Ops 6, the 7900 GRE is able to average 109 FPS. The RX 9070 is able to average 123 FPS. The RTX 3080 Ti is able to average 85 FPS. The RTX 5070 is able to average 86 FPS, meaning that the RTX 5070, RTX 3080 Ti, and the RX 9060 XT 16GB perform pretty much identical in this test. The 7900 GRE is about 20% faster in this test, and the RX 9070 is about 27% faster than the 5070. Moving on to Call of Duty Black Ops 6 at 4K. Moving on to Call of Duty Black Ops 6 at 4K, you see that the Radeon 7900 GRE and the RX 9070 are both able to render over 60 FPS. With the, the 7900 GRE is able to average 63 FPS. The RX 9070 is able to average 69 FPS. Nice. The RTX 3080 Ti is able to average 52 FPS. The RTX 5070 is able to average 51 FPS. Comparing the percentage differences across the entire mid-range here at 1080p across all benchmarks, you see that the 7900 GRE and the RTX 5070 are pretty close with each other. The RTX 5070 only being about 4% faster on average. 3080 Ti really seems to show its age compared to the other mid-ranges in this benchmark tests, being almost 10% slower than the 7900 GRE and almost 15% slower than the RTX 5070. In these tests, the RX 9070 really seems to pull ahead, being almost 15% faster than the RTX 5070. At 1440p, you see that the 7900 GRE is able to average across all games 120 FPS, meaning that it is about 10% faster than the RTX 3080 Ti, pretty much neck and neck with the RTX 5070, and the RX 9070 pulls ahead by the RX 9070 pulls ahead by 18%. over the RTX 5070 and the 7900 GRE. Moving on to 4K, the RTX 5070 seems to fare a little bit better here, being faster on average than the 7900 GRE and the RTX 3080 Ti. The RX 9070 seems to really pull ahead here as well at almost 20% faster than the RTX 5070. And then overall FPS averages, the 7900 GRE and the RTX 5070 perform pretty much the same, with the RTX 5070 coming out only 3% ahead. The RX 9070 coming out 20% ahead of the RTX 5070 and the 7900 GRE. 3080 Ti really seems to struggle here, being the slowest of the bunch by over 10%. Moving on to cost per frame, which is I think the most important part of this list. At launch pricing, if you look at the 7900 GRE's launch price of $549 US, at 1080p it offers a cost per frame of $3.72. At 1440p it costs $4.55 per frame. At 4K it costs $7.60 per frame. The RX 9070 at its MSRP would mean at 1080p it costed almost $3 per frame. At 1440p it costs $3.75 per frame. At 4K it costs $5.65 per frame, being one of the best values in the mid-range across the board if it was its MSRP. The RTX 3080 Ti at $1,199 US MSRP, it offers the worst cost per frame at MSRP, being at 1080p it costed $9 per frame. 1440p costs over $11 per frame, and at 4K it costs over $15 per frame. The RTX 5070 at its MSRP of $549, it offers kind of the middle of the pack for cost per frame. At 1080p, $3.55. At 1440p, $4.54. And at 4K, $6.91. Now, if we go to actual pricing in the US, from what you can see on eBay, the 7900 GRE has listings for all sorts of different pricing. So I just put $465. You can find some that are cheaper, some that are more expensive. That's why I just went with a kind of an average price of $465, meaning at 1080p it offers a cost per frame of $3.15. At 1440p it costs $3.86 a frame. At 4K it costs $6.44 per frame. Moving on to the RX 9070, it is the only card on this list that is above its MSRP at $600 US, being $50 more than its $549 US MSRP, meaning that the cost per frame is actually worse than it would be at its MSRP. So 1080p it costs $3.27 per frame. At 1440p it costs $4 per frame. At 4K it costs over $6 per frame. Moving on to 3080 Ti, you seem to regularly be able to pick them up on the used market on eBay, Facebook Marketplace for around $400-ish US, meaning that it costs a little over $3 per frame at 1080p. At 1440p it costs $3.75, and at 4K it costs $6.40. And at 4K it costs $5.43 per frame. The RTX 5070 is at its MSRP pretty regularly across the board, so it costs the same it has the same cost per frame as it did in our previous chart. We'll go over it real quick again. At 1080p has an average cost per frame of $3.55. 1440p it costs $4.54 per frame, and at 4K it costs almost $7 per frame. So there you have it. Are the results for our cards. So the results of our benchmark testing, the 6 titles that we tested, again at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K across all 3 resolutions that are pretty common nowadays. As always, our test bench is very much testing these GPUs in a best case scenario using the Ryzen 7 9800X3D on the AM5 platform with a motherboard that supports PCIe Gen 5 along with DDR5 6000 CL28 memory. So again, so very much so. Your mileage may vary if you're running into PCIe bandwidth issues with some of these cards, or if you run into VRAM limitations with some of these cards, being that the RTX 5070 and the RTX 3080 Ti only offer 12 gigabytes of VRAM. There's some titles at 1440p you do run into VRAM limitations. At 1080p, you're pretty safe that you will not run into any kind of VRAM limitations. At 4K, 12 gigabytes of VRAM really gets to be really tight, especially running at high settings. On the Radeon side, on the RX 7900 GRE and the RX 9070, they both offer 16 gigabytes of VRAM, which is pretty comfortable across the board. So our recommendations in this video, the RTX 5070 really offers pretty good value from the standpoint it offers DLSS 4 support, multi-frame generation, and it offers at its MSRP 12 gigabytes of VRAM, GDDR7. Now we are in desperate need of a 5070 Super Series. It is rumored to have 16 gigabytes on the RX side of things. The graphics cards need to come back down to MSRP in order to be more viable. At $600 US, the RX 9070 isn't a terrible value. However, FSR 4 support versus DLSS support on the Radeon side, FSR 4 is not as widely available as DLSS and is also not as good as the newest version of DLSS. Now, the 7900 GRE is kind of in a weird spot for us. One, because it does not offer true FSR 4 support. Now, there is ways to get FSR 4 support or a version of FSR 4, and that is using OptiScaler. It is not a full implementation of FSR 4. However, it is it's in between FSR 3 and FSR 4. It's a weird version, but it does work if you want to do some tinkering. The 7900 GRE is a good card on the used market. But for us, I think the recommendation in the mid range currently is either the RTX 5070, or if you really want a Radeon card and you want to spend the extra little bit of money for the raw rasterization performance and forego a little bit of ray tracing performance, the RX 9070 is an okay buy. If you want to take the gamble on the used market, 3080 Ti, if you could pick it up for a little under $400 US, maybe $400 max US, and you want to take the gamble on whether it functions for a long time or not, that is an option up to you. I think that would be a good option. The RTX 3080, however, is around $350 US regularly, but it only offers 10 gigabytes of VRAM. And being that 12 gigabytes of VRAM is already a tough sell at 1440p, two extra gigs less of VRAM, I kind of would not recommend it in current games in 2025. So there you have it. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, comment other videos you want to see in the future. Consider subscribing if you want to find your way back for future content, and I'll see you all in the next one.